Okay, welcome to everyone here and also joining us on Zoom. This is the 12th and final Center for Japanese Studies lecture for winter 2023. I'm Josh Hausman, a member of the Center for Japanese Studies and associate professor at the Public Policy School and an economist by training. I'm very happy to be in a minute introducing our speaker for today, David Weinstein. But first, let me make a couple general announcements for the Center of Japanese Studies. First is that you can join us on Monday at 4:30 for an online panel featuring Center for Japanese Studies alumni who will be sharing what they've been doing in scholarship and work, and there'll be a discussion about about the field of Japanese studies in general. That will be the final Center for Japanese Studies event this semester, so hope to see many of you there. Just a logistical note for those of you who are joining us online. Webcams and microphones are muted, but you can use the Q&A function during the lecture to submit any questions that you have, and I'll be monitoring those questions, and then we'll try to ask those for you. Also, there's closed captioning enabled, but you can disable that if you like. And finally, let me just say to please look at the Center for Japanese Studies events page online, or if you're here, I think there may also be some leaflets there. And you can look at events that are scheduled for the future in the fall. Okay, so with that, let me introduce Professor David Weinstein, who we're incredibly happy to have here visiting us at Michigan. So Professor David Weinstein is the Carl Sumner Shoup Professor of the Japanese Economy at Columbia University. He is the director of the Center for Japanese Economy and Business at the Graduate School of Business at Columbia. That is, I think, definitely the premier center for studying the Japanese economy in the United States. He is also the co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research Japan Project. I am particularly happy to be welcoming Professor Weinstein to Michigan because he got his PhD in economics from Michigan. He worked with Gary Saxonhouse, who I think some people here may know. And he also was a faculty member at the Michigan Business School in the 1990s. So with that, I'm very happy to welcome Professor Weinstein, who will be telling us about From Malthus to Miracle, Why Japan Developed. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Well, thanks very much for that very nice, very kind introduction. It's great to be back here. As Josh mentioned, I got my PhD here, and I work very closely with a very eminent historian or economic historian of Japan, Gary Saxonhouse, who's really a titan in the field, very kind of intimidating, but also very kind person, and certainly shaped my own understanding of Japan, and very much pushed his students to not just to try to always dig deeper into why things in Japan look so different than in other countries, and with a strong focus on economic motives, and you'll kind of see that influence today in this talk. So really appreciate having the opportunity to come here. This talk is going to be joint with Reka Juhasz, who's a professor at UBC, and Shogo Sokabe, who just got his PhD from Columbia. And the motivation for thinking about this is something I always start my course on the economic development of Japan with, is a picture like this one, which shows you per capita incomes of countries in the world in 2020. And the dark countries, the countries in the dark blue, are those countries that are rich in the sense that they have per capita incomes in excess of 40,000. And one of the things that's really interesting when you look at a picture like this is that it kind of something jumps out right away, that there basically are three classes of very rich countries in the world. There's English-speaking countries, or countries that are close to England right? So that's North America, Europe. There are petrostates, that is countries that sit atop massive amounts of oil. Those countries are also quite rich. And then there are countries that are either Japan or Japan's former colonies. And so this kind of is a striking feature about the world. But when you kind of think about development or why certain countries develop, well, there are a lot of theories and good explanations for what went right in England. It's kind of obvious why sitting on top of a massive amount of oil makes you rich. It's not obvious why Japan and its former colonies ended up in that category. So kind of this paper, this is kind of one of the big motivating questions in my economic development of Japan class. And this paper is an attempt to kind of try to understand this phenomenon. So we're going to be using a lot of data from a variety of sources, history, linguistics, etc., to try to answer this question. And the first thing that I want to suggest to you, just to kind of give you a sense of how anomalous Japan is that language is one of these variables that seems to matter a lot in terms of understanding kind of which countries become rich. This is a plot showing you GNP per capita income on the vertical axis, and how a country's population does on an English test on the horizontal axis. And you can see that there's this positive relationship. It's a strong positive relationship. And you can do this using more advanced statistical techniques, and the relationship between English language capability and country per capita income is a very strong one, right? And one of the wealthiest countries in Asia is Singapore, which also is very, is fundamental, or at least a plurality of the people are speaking English in that place. But Japan looks like an outlier in this, right? Its English is not so great overall, but it has fairly high income by this metric, right? And so you can start to see, well, when I was giving you those stylized facts in the beginning, right? Either you speak English or you're close to England. Countries that are close to England tend to have languages that are linguistically close to English. So, for example, on State Department proficiency scores, it takes, or State Department reckons that it takes about 6 months of intensive language training for you to be able to read documents in French. It takes about 3 years of intensive Japanese training to be able to have the same proficiency in Japanese or in Chinese or in Arabic, right? And those countries, tend to have lower incomes. But again, Japan is a big exception. Korea is another big exception, or South Korea. So kind of why is this? What's going on in the background? So kind of when economists at least have been thinking about what is going on here, there's been a lot of work on what went right in Britain, and in particular, the British were the first to develop a patent system, and patents are extremely important because it's a way of monetizing good ideas. And that's a non-obvious concept, but the fact that British could do that certainly gave inventors or smart people strong incentives to invest their time in understanding engineering. And we're going to be focusing a lot on that. A second big hypothesis for why the world looks that way is that Britain also was exceptional in the 19th century, or even earlier, in that it had massive coal deposits. So the price of coal was extremely low. And if you think about what a lot of what caused countries to break out of the extreme poverty that existed before the Industrial Revolution, a lot of it was related to the ability to run steam engines and power things, right? So that was another thing that was working for Britain. And certainly these things were not working well for China. China, at 1600, had a lot of the same types of scientific breakthroughs. In fact, often China had the breakthroughs before they happened in the West. But again, something goes, China doesn't have either the tradition of patenting or easy access to coal. And so that may explain China. But it doesn't really, but it leaves unanswered kind of what's going on in countries that were part of Imperial Japan. So what we argue in this paper is that what's going on is that the Japanese government made very unique, very large, what economists call public good investments. That is, investments in things that are like education, or as we're going to see, language. Language is going to play a really important role in this, and essentially enhancing the ability of Japanese people to read science, okay? And when I say read science, I mean very applied science, like engineering, okay? And this is something we're going to see is going to be very striking, both within Japan, and also it's going to be unique. Then the other thing that I'm going to talk very briefly about at the end is the role played by coal. Probably now we all think of Japan as a resource-poor country, but in the 19th century, Japan had pretty big mining operations, gold, silver, but especially coal. It was a regional, major regional exporter of coal after it gains the technology to sink deep mines. Okay. So let me just give you the basic idea for what is going to be the structure of the talk, and then we'll go into a lot of the details. So kind of the idea that I'm going to be pushing is almost obvious. That is, it is really hard to learn science if you have no texts to read. Okay, that's just a hard thing to do. Okay, and why is it hard? If you don't have words that you can use to describe scientific concepts, and when I talk about scientific concepts, I'm going to use the word jargon, right? So when you're reading engineering, you need to have a lot of words that don't exist in languages that don't have a science tradition. Okay. And essentially, what's going to really mark a big break in Japan is something that's not really talked about in most histories, and that is that the Japanese enlist in a major project to transform the Japanese language in a very fundamental sense, and also create the Japanese versions of jargon that are going to be very easy for Japanese to understand. And once you do that, you can start doing translations that are easily accessible for large numbers of people. And we're going to see that that's going to explain a lot of Japanese growth. Now, that's not the only policy they did, right? So Japan is going to embark on a massive technology policy between 1868 and 1875. Japanese government expenditures are going to go up by about 150%. A lot of that being driven by expenditures on education, on hiring foreign educators. That's going to be about 50% of the Ministry of Education budget is going to be going for that type of thing. Those types of expenditures are going to help explain why Japanese expenditures on education are going to go up by a factor of 20 over that time period. So they're going to be learning how to learn is going to be one big thing, okay? And what we're going to see is that once they have the ability to translate jargon into Japanese and native Japanese languages, we're going to then see that the translation of technical books is going to skyrocket in Japan. Suddenly they're reading, they can read technology, British technology, in Japanese, okay? Not using transliterated words, okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to then link that capacity to read foreign technical works to the actual growth rates of productivity in Japanese industries. And we're going to see that in Japan, you can explain which industries are taking off based on how similar the word usages are in those industries to word usages in British patents. But we're going to see that other countries, like China, are not going to exhibit that pattern. Japan's going to be a real outlier in the 19th century in their ability to read and absorb foreign knowledge. And again, it's only going to happen after they get access to the technical translations, and those technical translations are all done by government translators. So the first 20 years after they open up to the West, almost nothing's happening in Japan. And then right after they start subsidizing these technical translations, Japan suddenly pulls ahead. So in order to do this, we're kind of reapproaching Japanese history kind of from a statistical method. So we're going to build a data set that's going to let us measure productivity growth for about 100 industries for 70 regions. So regions for us are going to be things like they could be countries, they could be colonies. So we call them regions to be inclusive. And kind of the way that we're going to do this is we're going to get trade data from all these different from a series of different countries. The trade data lets us know bilateral trade flows by industry in the 19th century. So Japanese trade data goes back to 1873, bilateral data. We'll be starting in 1875. One thing that you may know is that kind of one of the oldest theories in economics is the theory of comparative advantage. And what the theory of comparative advantage says is that if one country is relatively more productive in an industry, it will tend to export in that industry. Okay, that's the basic idea of comparative advantage. So what we're just going to do in this paper, and I won't take you through all the technical things, is just kind of reverse that statement, which is basically to say, if I see that Japan is exporting a lot in a certain industry, say cotton textiles, that must mean that it's very productive in those sectors. So we're going to one of the big contributions in terms of data work is that for the first time we're going to be able to see industry productivity for the 19th century. And we're going to get that off of trade data. A second big thing that we're going to bring in is we're going to we're going to build a data set about what it is that people in the 19th century actually understood about science. And there we've just we've digitized all scientific books between 1600 and 1880 in English, figuring that if you could read that, you pretty much understood what Western science would have looked like. And then we also identify which books are relevant for which industry. So we kind of went through and this whole corpus of books, trying to find the ones that describe how do you make, textiles, or how do you make how do you do mining or whatever, books that are technical books. We then also digitize the descriptions of every patent between 1617 and 1852. So then we have a data set that tells us about all the word usages in British patents, right, to understand what jargon would you have needed to understand, what words would you have needed to understand in order to understand Western technology. And then what we're going to do is going to put those two data sets together, and we're going to say, if your industry requires words that are very similar to words used in British patents, then that means that those patents are pretty relevant for you. And if your industry is, say, rice, and it doesn't use words that often appear in British patents, then probably British patents are not going to be that useful for you. So we're going to be able to score industries based on how similar they are to patents, and that's going to kind of set up the basic idea that we're exploring. Is is it the case that when British patents are highly relevant for, say, a Japanese industry, that industry takes off once they get access to the books? And to what extent is that true for the other 70 countries in our sample? And then we're going to also be doing something similar to kind of look at how important coal is. So we built a data set that lets us see coal prices in about 23 different countries in the 19th century. So the basic idea is that when coal prices are low, that probably means you've got access to a lot of coal, and it's cheap to use. And then we also have data from France on kind of the steam power intensity of every industry in 1860, which then lets us know, is coal relevant for an industry? And if so, right, then we might expect that when coal prices are low, industries that use steam power a lot should take off, okay? Either in terms of exports or in terms of productivity. And so that's going to be kind of how we're going to think about a lot of these issues, how we're going to kind of take different theories and operationalize them and try to understand what was happening in the 19th century in the world. Okay. So obviously we're related to a lot of literature and history and economics. So we're going to there's a lot of work that suggests that the opening of Japan to international trade, which is going to happen actually before this sample, only has very small impacts on Japanese economic development. I'll show you the data a little later. Similarly, a lot of studies have been done about different Meiji reforms that indicate that these things had small or no effects, model factories, et cetera. So we're going to be pushing this argument that it was the Japanese investment in technology, technology literacy, that's going to be the big part of the story. There's also been work on, a lot of work on why Europe, not so much work on why not anywhere else. And we're going to be thinking a lot about this knowledge acquisition element of what was going on in Japan. And I'm going to toss it out, toss out this idea that no other country spent anything like what Japan spent in terms of learning technology. And then we're going to, probably most controversial, at least for a set of economists, is that we're going to see that a country's coal abundance doesn't explain growth very well, or at least not robustly. So we think it's kind of technology that's going to be the key. Okay, so now let me just start talking a little bit about economic growth, how we think about it as economists, and I'll just show this to you in a couple of pictures. So this is the only graph you're going to see in the paper, or a theoretical graph you're going to see. The rest of it will just be data. So I want to just start by talking about what economists call the Malthusian model. So this basically describes most of the world, all of the world, up until the Industrial Revolution. And the model is incredibly simple. So David Malthus, writing in the 18th century, thinks, okay, well, what determines output in an economy? Well, it's labor and it's land, your farmers. And so if you've got a given amount of land, but you've got a very low population, your population is low, well, that's good news because you're going to get you're going to be relatively rich because you could farm the most fertile parts of that land, and so you're going to have high income. On the other hand, if you have a lot of people farming the same amount of land, right, you have to work really intensively to get any marginal increase in output, and so your wages will tend to be low. But the key thing to remember is that in pre-modern societies, people are quite poor. Malnutrition is an issue. So if your wages are high, what's going to happen is your children are more likely to survive, but then your population grows, and that pulls your wages down to the point of a subsistence wage, which we're marking here in this plot as WS. And similarly, if your population is really high, then what that means is that you've got a lot of people working the land. You're not producing that much per capita. Your total production may be high, but per person you're not producing a lot. That's going to mean you're going to have low wages, and if you have low wages, that's going to result in people dying of malnutrition, and then eventually your population edges back to this subsistence level. Okay, is the basic idea of Malthus. So you go, okay, this is just theory. What does this look like in reality? So this is what it looks like for Britain. So here we've got wages on the vertical axis and population on the horizontal axis, and you can see, right? You can start around 1250. You get population rising, you get the Black Death in the early 14th century driving down that population, you get the War of the Roses in the 15th century driving it down even more, wages go up, right, and then it kind of goes back down. So kind of if you're thinking, the Malthusian model is actually a pretty darn good model for understanding a lot of countries, or at least for Britain. But then, when you think about what was happening in Britain, you can see that something changes. Okay, something changes roughly. We can debate exactly the year, but something in the 17th century changes in Britain. Okay, and the whole relationship falls apart, and this is what we think is the Industrial Revolution. And what's really changing here is that the technology in Britain is increasing, and that's not in the Malthus model, and we're just getting better and better and better at producing stuff, okay? And you get this upward, population ceases to predict lower wages. So now let's turn our attention to Japan, okay? So I see Tomi here. So I'm now going to do all of Japanese history in one slide. So hopefully she won't throw anything at me. So we have some relevant history. Probably most of you, or those of you who studied Japanese history, will know this. So Japan was open to the West. There were Portuguese and Spanish missionaries that came to Japan in the 16th century. Early 17th century, Japan closes to the West in terms of trade. It closes to the West in terms of ability of people to come in and out of Japan. And then in 1853, the Americans send a mission to Japan, partially because they want access to Japanese coal. And this Perry mission forces Japan to open, and Japan is substantially open to, almost completely open to trade in 1858. Okay, and so kind of one thing that's kind of important in this story is it's not, Japanese development is not about the domestic politics. It's or trying to create a modern state. It's kind of something that happens after Japan is forced to open. So now let's turn to the Malthus model and kind of just thinking about this for Japan. So on this plot, what I've got is what was happening to real wages in Japan. So this is, we're looking at Japanese real wages from 1820 to 1870 here. So this is the last period of the Tokugawa regime. And we're scaling them so that if the wages were 1, they would equal UK wages in the 1880s. And you can see that Japan in 1820 is roughly a third or less than a third the level of the UK. That then falls over time as the population rises. And so it's kind of striking that it looks a lot like the British graph. It's a shorter time period, but as Japanese population grows, Japanese become poorer, and there's certainly a lot of stories about immiseration of samurai and others during this time period. What's also interesting in this picture is that Japan opens up to free. The West arrives in 1854, and then free trade regime begins in 1858. And you can see that by 10 years after Japan has opened up to free trade, it's poor, right? And you can also understand why there are a lot of people who are thinking this is not such a good idea. But I think this plot makes it clear that Japan was in a Malthusian type of equilibrium during this time period. And then, of course, something changes, right? And you see Japanese wages, roughly 1869, 1870, start to kind of, let's say, stop decreasing. And clearly after 1871, you get this big boom in Japanese wages. And you also see, just even trending out to 1910, population in Japan is booming, almost doubling, and wages in Japan are continuing to rise. So something big is happening in Japan. That's what the data is telling us. Okay. So now let's turn to thinking a little bit about how do you learn Western technology? How did the Japanese learn Western technology? Okay. So one thing that, when you read Japanese history, I'm going to just toss this out, there's a lot about Meiji, but actually a lot of what the Meiji people were doing was already started by the Bakufu, which is the shogun's government in the Tokugawa period. And actually, shortly after they signed the treaty opening up Japan to trade, the shogun's government, the Bakufu, begins subsidizing translations. But the problem they hit almost immediately when they start to do the translations is there are no Japanese words for technical terms, right? And we're going to talk a lot about, I'll take you through the term locomotive, but at that point, right, they saw locomotives. The Americans brought locomotives to Japan. They didn't have a word for locomotives, right? And they didn't have a word for deposit and all sorts of jargon that are used in creating modern systems, okay? And you see this in the reports that they send in these missions abroad and they come back to Japan and they can't explain anything because they've learned English and they know how to say it in English, but they don't know how to say it in Japanese. And there's a really nice history of this, and it talks about the linguistic chaos in Japan in the 1860s as they're trying to understand what's making the West rich, and they don't have any words to talk about it. The Japanese government at this time period comes up with 3 possible solutions that are debated very seriously. So one is just give up on Japanese and teach English. And you actually see that type of solution in a lot of countries in the world today where, like, if you're giving a technical talk in science, it's done in English because it's just, let's just give up on this. We don't have the words. Second approach is transliterate. Okay, transliteration is actually pretty easy for the translator, but it's hard for the reader, right? Because if you start to read, if you ever sat down with a text in biology or something, it's like all these Greek words coming up, and you just don't know what it is, and you very quickly lose track. And then the third option was to embark on a government project to translate English jargon into Chinese characters. And then in a way that makes the words easy to understand. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on that because that's the option that Japan does. And they first produced the first technical English-Japanese dictionary in 1871. And just for a point of comparison, if you're Thinking about China, you don't get a technical dictionary in China for 40 years later. So the Japanese are going to have a 40-year edge on reading engineering over China. So let's go through this word locomotive, okay, just as an example of one of the many pieces of jargon the Japanese have to wrestle with. So it doesn't exist in the Japanese language prior to 1871. And one of the problems in alphabetic systems is that it's very hard to infer the meaning of a word, especially a word of jargon, from its spelling. Even if you were to know Latin, right, it would be hard to go from locomotive, right, here move, or place move, into, like, this is actually some sort of machine that's going to move a car down a track, okay? But they're going to leverage something that's unique about, not unique, but is characteristic about East Asian languages, or some of the East Asian languages, and that is that they are glyph-based languages, right? So every character has a meaning, okay? And everybody who's literate is going to know what that meaning is, right? And so what the Japanese government translators are going to do is they're going to leverage that fact of glyph-based systems, right, to assign characters that describe the scientific concept that's being used. So in the case of locomotive, what they're going to do, government translators are going to say, you know, what is a locomotive engine? It's like a steam-powered car. That's what a locomotive is. And so they're going to take the characters for steam, joki, and they'll take the character for cart or car, sha, and they're going to put those together, and they're going to say that's going to be the Japanese word. Okay. Now, any literate Japanese, when they first see it, they may not guess what that is. But if they kind of realize, you know, if you hear steam cart, or you're reading and you see steam cart, it's kind of intuitive. It's easy to remember what this is, right? Algebra. If I asked you what algebra means, probably none of you would know it because you don't know Arabic. I realize I'm making a generalization. Someone's going to raise their hand. I know Arabic, but most Americans wouldn't. And so it's just, you just have to memorize that piece of jargon. In Japanese, the characters would be number substitution, right? Kind of intuitive, right? And that's going to be right along the line, okay? And linguists think that this kind of gives glyph-based systems an advantage when doing translation. So I'm going to kind of take you through this a little bit. I may run a little bit over, so if that's okay, because this is kind of fun. So why are the Japanese going to do this? Well, they did it once before. Okay, so if you think about linguistic systems, especially writing systems, we all end up. Writing systems are only invented, 4 or 5 times in the world, and then everybody just kind of adapts whatever writing system was kind of in the countries closest to them to their own language, which makes writing kind of hard. So Japan did this with Chinese, and this is just a copy of a text, the earliest Japanese history from 720. The Nihon Shoki, and and this text is written in classical Chinese, that is Chinese of about 2,000 years ago, and what they developed was they realized, like, if you could read the Chinese characters, okay, you still had to struggle with the Chinese grammar, which is different than Japanese grammar. So it's subject, verb, object instead of subject, object, verb. But you can put in these little diacritic marks to essentially identify subjects and things like this, and then you can actually read it. So in fact, if you look at this piece of text, right, it's kind of, you can start to guess, right, even without knowing any classical Chinese or what's going on, you kind of see after now, It's from now after must use copper coin, stop use gold coin, right? So you don't know any classical Chinese, but if you knew the glyphs, you could make out kind of some of the meaning, and indeed it means, in this particular moment, that people were going to stop using copper coins and use. Did I say gold? I meant silver coins. We're going to start using silver coins, which was a monetary unit popular in China. So, right, and any Japanese high school kid, right, is going to get some training in this today, but historically all literate Japanese would be able to, or many of the literate Japanese would be able to read this kind of or use this algorithmic translation, because in fact a lot of Japanese documents were written in classical Chinese. Okay, it doesn't matter that they can't pronounce it, they have no idea, nobody has any idea or much of an idea what it sounded like 2,000 years ago, but there it is. Okay. So this kind of translation system appears in Japan, Korea initially, and then and it coincides with a huge change in Japanese culture. So I'd like to just summarize it by showing you Japanese art from 500 and 609. So roughly, this is before there's any algorithmic translation. This is after there's algorithmic translation. And suddenly, Japan goes from producing stuff that's kind of hardly recognizable as modern Japanese, and suddenly they're producing, images like this just 100 years later. And of course, Buddhism enters Japan at this time, and Japanese architecture, Nara is built, and all that kind of stuff, right? Well, yeah, suddenly you understand what's happening in China, and you're crossing a boundary, and suddenly you understand that technology. So that they had, that and Vietnam also had that, okay? And Korea has this. So now fast forward to the 1860s, and you can kind of see these are the first two dictionaries ever created mapping English into Japanese. The first dictionary is from, I'm going to talk about it from 1866, although there's a small print run in 1862. And it's a small dictionary that's run, very little in terms of jargon translation. I'm going to call that the ETSJ. And then 1871, government translators produce a much bigger English-Japanese dictionary, roughly 2 to 3 times larger, and much of that addition is going to be new words is going to be the translation of jargon. So let's just take a look at what that looks like. So here you are, 1866, if you have the dictionary. The dictionary is going to tell you, let's say take a word like locomotive or locomotive engine. It gives you the following translation here. What's kind of and you can read the English version of that. What's really interesting about that translation is they're not giving you a Japanese word for locomotive. They're kind of telling you the meaning of it. It's actually not the meaning that most of you would think about, but there is a meaning that locomotive is actually that animals that move versus animals that don't, which was kind of the meaning. And so it's wrong, but it's also not a word, right? Like even if you had that dictionary, you could not use it in a sentence in Japanese, okay? 1871, we get something that is the modern word, or at least the modern word for steam train, which is literally these 3 characters over here, which are, the first 2 are steam, and the last is sha. That later gets shortened from jokisha to kisha, but it's the word, right, is there, right? And suddenly people can start to read, they've got jargon in Japanese to use those words. So now let's talk a little bit about how the Japanese language changed. So one of the things that we did was we just digitized all the etymologies of every Japanese word, and then we just kind of asked the question, how many new words were being created in Japan in the run-up to the arrival of the Americans, and then what happens later, okay? So you can kind of see that before the Americans arrived, before the Perry mission, Japan's kind of crunching along at 50 to 100 new words every year. A lot of these words are like a new type of frog or a flower or something like that, right? But not a lot of word creation. And then you might think, okay, well, the Americans arrive over here. 1854, they're bringing telegraph machines, they're bringing steamships, they're bringing railroads that the Japanese are seeing, right? So surely, right, we see all this stuff. Surely they must be like describing this, all this technology. Nothing, right? You can kind of just see nothing is happening in the Japanese language, okay? But then when you get that big print run of that first dictionary, suddenly the number of new words entering the Japanese language jumps to around about 500 words per year. And then as you get the second dictionary kicking in, you get that next big spike, and you start getting a lot of new words entering into the Japanese language. So clearly, right, I mentioned earlier this book, the Kokugo Revolution, which is kind of how they transform their language. This is what language transformation starts to look like. You're suddenly getting words. You can talk about things that you never could talk about before, okay? But let's take this now into science, because a lot of the words that are being created are not scientific words. They're words about other things, governments or things like this. So what we did was we went through the National Diet Library in Japan, which is the biggest library they have, and we digitized, or we scraped out of the library every technical book that got translated into the Japanese language, okay? So up until the arrival of the Americans, there were only 10 books that got translated into Japanese. So if you were a smart Japanese and you knew about all this Western technology and you wanted to learn about it, you had nothing to read, for the most part. Then the Americans arrive, and the first 17 years after the Americans arrive, only 3 more books get translated, right? So again, you could be in the Meiji Restoration, they could be doing all, wanting to learn stuff, you have nothing to read, okay? Was the state of affairs. But then you can see that very shortly after that second dictionary appears, right, the number of translated books, which is that orange line, skyrockets, right? Suddenly they're translating engineering. And we also went through a biographical dictionary of all the translators, and we found that 80% of these translators are government employees. So the private sector is not delivering this. This is the government doing this, okay? So this plot just kind of zooms in on the early Meiji period to kind of give you a sense quantitatively of how many books, how many technical books are appearing in the Japanese language. And you can see, 1870, virtually nothing is there, right? So entrepreneurs in the early 1870s had nothing to read about Western technology. But by 1880, you've got about 150 technical books, like engineering books, to read, okay? So I think back to my undergraduate days, 150 books in STEM fields, that's a lot of books to read, okay? I probably didn't read that as an undergrad. So there's a lot there, and by 1885, it's at 200 books. So suddenly, they have a big corpus that they can read to help them. Right? As I mentioned, the other thing that happens in the background is you get compulsory education. The Ministry of Education budget is exploding. This is just showing you how what's happening to that Ministry of Education budget, mandatory primary school education, creation of high schools, universities, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of supplementary stuff that they're spending on to kind of get people to understand math, science, and applied fields. So just in terms of the timing, so that we're clear about the timing of Japanese manufacturing development and economic development, what I plotted out here is the share of what we call primary exports coming out of Japan. So primary exports are things like agriculture, forestry, fisheries, mining stuff that's coming out of Japan. And you can see that in the early Meiji period, right, at least straight through 1880s, Japan is just a commodity exporter. They're not doing much manufacturing. And there's not even any trend here, right? They're creating a lot of institutions over here, but there's no trend whatsoever in terms of that transforming the Japanese economy. But once you get about 150 engineering books, you suddenly see that the share of primary exports collapses, manufacturing takes off, and in about 15 years, right, the share of manufacturing exports triples, okay? So again, there's a big change in Japanese industries that's happening just after they suddenly get books explaining technical concepts that are industry related in Japan. Okay. So now let me go into, this is kind of the background. So now let's go and just see how well this links to the data on Japanese economic growth. So, so kind of as I mentioned at the outset, if this is mattering for Japanese manufacturing, right? You see manufacturing moving as a whole. Are we seeing it mattering in the subfields of manufacturing where we think it should matter the most? So in particular, we think that if what's really happening in Japan is Japanese can now read British patents and they can also read books on how to make various products, then the products that require the knowledge in British patents should be precisely the products that expand, and other products, like rice, wouldn't expect British patents to matter that much for. So that's going to be our first hypothesis, that these British patents are going to be explaining, or industries that use words that are similar to the words used in British patents are going to be the industries that are going to benefit the most from British patents. And then the second question is Japan unique? Maybe everybody does this. Isn't it obvious, right? Isn't it obvious that you should just, Britain has this great technology. Let's just go out and, absorb it, right? Why, other countries can easily, maybe other countries can easily do this. So I'm arguing that you really do need, this massive expenditure on translation, education, and all of this in order to absorb that knowledge. And so if that's true, then we should see it for Japan, but we shouldn't see it for other countries. They're going to have to struggle to figure out how to translate technical stuff into their own language, okay? So we're going to want to also see not only that it's positive for Japan, but it doesn't exist in other countries, right? So that's what we want the data to tell us, okay? So let's take a look at the data. So this is a plot in which on the horizontal axis, I have British patent relevance down there. And you can think, there's kind of like a lot of technical stuff behind how you construct it, but it's kind of like saying, if I knew what was in a British patent, if I use those as keywords and I type that into Google, we're using kind of same basic idea that underlies Google, how likely is it that I would, if I typed into ChatGPT, which industry is the industry that's going to benefit me the most from knowing British patents? Industries that would come out here with a high score are going to be the ones where the patents are relevant, and the ones on this end are going to be those that are not. And then on the vertical axis, I have the export growth rates in Japan of different industries between 1880 and 1910, right? That period of growth. And just so that you're clear, like these are there are industries out there like this industry, I don't know which one this is, which is growing at around 40% a year. So there are industries that are really taking off in Japan over this time period. And you can see that there's this kind of clear upward relationship that when British patents are relevant for industries in Japan, they seem to take off. So then you might say, okay, but maybe this is just obvious. Of course you go and you learn British patents. So this is what it looks like for the rest of the world, and you don't see it there, okay? And I'll drill in a little bit more into these countries, but the point is that, if anything, it's a negative relationship overall, but it's basically nothing is what I see when I look at this, okay? What about productivity? So that was exports, right? So, you might worry about exports, maybe it's, Japan's trading partners are expanding along these lines or something like that. How much of this is being driven by Japanese by Japanese productivity? So this here is Japanese productivity growth on the vertical axis. And this is British patent relevance again. And you can see that there's an upward sloping relationship here between how relevant the British technology is and what the growth rate of productivity is in these sectors, okay? So again, it seems like the Japanese are learning stuff over this period, and what in the industries where they have the most to learn, that's where they're taking off, and you're getting these high productivity growth rates. But then you can say, well, what about the rest of the world in terms of productivity? Again, it looks just like what it looks like in exports. Really, there's no relationship in the rest of the world. But maybe you say, okay, well, the rest of the world is kind of a homogeneous place. Let's just divide it up into different, is a heterogeneous place. Let's divide it up into different groups. I'll show you just a few versions of this. So we divided up the 19th century world into high-income regions, middle-income regions, and low-income regions. So Japan in this time period is a medium-income region. And you see that it's hard to tell on this plot, but there's not much of a relationship for the high-income regions. There's not much of a relationship for the medium-income regions. So other countries that had per capita incomes that are similar don't seem to be learning. And actually, if you look at the low-income regions, because they're losing, so when you have this cluster of points down here is when the industry is just ceasing to exist. It's just no longer competitive. They're actually diverging, right? So they're just not, they're ending up producing more commodities and less of everything else. And Asian regions at this time period, if anything, are diverging. So Japan's taking off, but that's not what's happening in the rest of the world or Asia or countries like Japan. There's something really very special that's happening in Japan at this time period. Okay, I realize I'm basically out of time. I've got just 2 slides to go, so I won't show you a lot of stuff on coal. But one thing that is interesting is that at this time period, Japan was a major coal producer, as I mentioned. Britain had the lowest coal prices in the world. Japan was 3rd lowest. So it was pretty abundant in coal. Especially near Kyushu, you had a lot of big mines there. So potentially you might think that this is the story for Japan as well. But we don't see in the data that industries that use coal intensively, in general, grew faster at this time period when coal prices were cheaper. So that at least seems to suggest that the big story, at least for Japan, and actually also probably for the world, is that it's about technology. It's not about coal. Coal was traded at this time, which may have helped out countries that were further away. Okay, so I'm out of time. Let me just give you a couple of takeaways. So I think one of the big takeaways about development is it doesn't come cheap. you're going to have to spend huge amounts of money on making science and engineering easily accessible to large numbers of people. I've been often a critic of government policy, but I think this is a clear exception. And it seems that those investments in technology were key. And I think one of the other things is that, if you look at Japan, it doesn't look like the private sector was able to deliver this, right? The first 20 years after the Americans arrive, you just don't see much of a change. It's only after you have this big investment in these technologies that this changes. And so lastly, I know it's a hard sell to universities, but greater investment in education and basic research seems to enhance productivity growth. And that may be a very important lesson that we get from Japan. Okay, so thank you. It's been a great audience and happy to take questions. Hey, Dean. Uh-oh. Dean was a former student of mine, so now I'm really worried.
The bullet point you had on just the last slide about I actually...
Ooh, sorry, just dropped my phone.
Thanks, Josh. I actually remember that bullet point there about other research that you did on industrial policy, which you talked about when I was an undergrad in your class. But actually, that is what my question is about. I think your story is very compelling, and it's opened my eyes to an angle on industrial policy that I hadn't thought about before. But I wonder how you feel that other policies that Japan may have been pursuing at the same time may actually be either responsible instead for the patterns you're finding, or or complementary to the policy you're emphasizing regarding translation. I mean, as you know, the industrial policy is multidimensional. There are a number of different things governments do to try to promote development of different sectors. What else should we know about what's going on during this period? Is there really nothing else going on that could possibly...
Perfectly, great question. I knew I shouldn't have let you into my class. So I didn't get a chance to talk about this, and this is definitely, that part is work in progress. So we've got something that I'm going to bounce off. Well, first let me talk a little bit about those policies, and then I'll tell you where we're going with that question. So I'm not going to give you a full answer today, but I hope in a week's time, my RA will get me the results that I've been waiting for. At this time, you do see other policies happening. So most importantly, you see, most importantly, you have, there's some banking reform, there is land reform, policies that are going into place in the early 1870s, and you have people have written a lot about what they call model factories, which are done at this time period. So there's been other work that's been done. So the model factories, I think these are basically state-owned enterprises. The first thing about the state-owned enterprises is that they were financial disasters. So there's a nice paper by Mork and Nakamura about this, and they exist from about 1873 to about 1880, and they get privatized, and most of them were money losers. This is the Mork and Nakamura paper. So you if that's the story, it's kind of a little hard to reconcile why these enterprises didn't make money and then got privatized. And that's the key. In terms of industrial subsidies, I've been going through Japanese budget books, government budget books, and they have actually detailed budgets, but the amount of money that was being spent on industries is at this time is vanishingly small. So there's military expenditures for sure, but not outside of military. So again, they're not spending a lot of money, so it's kind of hard to believe that that's what's driving it. Land reform, again, that one's a little, that's a more involved issue, although it's not, it's kind of pretty far, it wouldn't explain kind of at least the cross-sectional pattern. But let me tell you what we're going to do to try to deal with this, is we have what we think is a good placebo test, which is we have data, right, the change occurs after the translations appear, which is kind of the 1880s, especially 1880, 1885, is really where you see kind of manufacturing take off. There's nothing happening before that. So certainly, so one thing that we want to, so first, whoops, if I can, I've lost my, oh, here we go. Nope, is this working? Here, oh, nope, I'm going the wrong direction. Wait, is this going, whoops, okay, let me, oh, wait, are you taking off my slides? Oh, could you just put them back on for a sec? So what we're thinking of is, if it was the earlier reforms that matter, then we should see the impact in the 10 years after the original reforms. So what we're going to try to look at is whether or not in that period before the books appear, because a lot of the translations occur, let's pull back, whoops. I just want to show one picture. So part of the reason I think that it's not this other stuff that's going on is this picture, right? You can kind of see that virtually all of the manufacturing takeoff is happening, after 1880. A lot of the reforms are in this early period, so you're kind of not seeing much for a while. And so we're kind of thinking, if we looked at like 1875 to 1885, would we see the patterns that we're seeing in the data? Because by that point, you've had at least 10 years of reform. And do you see that it's that earlier stuff that's mattering and that's why they're absorbing? Or is it something that happens after the books get translated? And whoops, I've lost my control of this. Here, right? And you can kind of see that kind of the translation of Japanese books is happening, it's heavily in this later period. And if you realize like you don't necessarily, read the book in the moment it appears, you'll probably be expecting a lot of the impact to be happening in that later period, just when we see it. But I don't have a full answer for you now, but hopefully in a week I will.
Do we have other? Yeah. And let me just also remind people on Zoom that you are more than welcome to put a question into the Q&A, and I will try to ask it.
Sure, great. Yeah. Thank you so much for a super engaging presentation. I learned a lot, and I usually run away from graphs these days, but I really appreciated your analysis. And it's more of a comment than a question, but I was just thinking, I saw the slides about imperialism, and I'm thinking about that and kind of how things change when Japan starts exporting, by force, kind of Japanese language to Taiwan, to Korea, and so forth, and how that other added dimension changes the kind of dynamics you're talking about. But I was thinking back to some of the work by folks like Christine Marin in her book Poison Woman, and basically how gender plays into this kind of situation. And what comes to mind are two things. One is actually the difference between different types of reading material that are geared more towards or even accessible the level of reading capacity or literacy between men and women around the same time. And she talks a lot about this in terms of, this kind of fictional literature about poison women and the koyomi shimbun and the oyomi. So the koyomi being more along the lines of the much more kind of Chinese kind of character heavy kind of work that's more accessible to kind of literate men versus the other kinds, which is for women. And a lot of the more fictional literature is actually in these ones that are kind of geared towards women. And so I was just wondering a little bit about kind of if one were to drill down into the data and think not just about this data set, which seems really interesting about the kind of patent literature, but other types of popular literature. And along those lines, what I'm thinking about is it's not just the kind of investment in kind of technical knowledge, but also this kind of, call it a kind of fetishism around kind of new inventions that are making their way into things like detective fiction, and think about like Revenge of the Photograph and these ways where it's like permeating into popular literature as well. And that seems like it might be a nice complement to some of the things that you're talking about, which to say it's not just, government employees who are translating, but also this kind of popular fiction that's also kind of helping to get people who might not be as technically kind of inclined, but to kind of whet their appetites in some ways for these things by dropping in, cameras or locomotives or something into the fictional realm, which then kind of supplements or helps to kind of bolster some of these things. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
So you're touching on a lot of points, and they're great points. And I want to talk a little bit about women and how this is going to impact them. And also I'll bring in some photographic evidence of what's going on here. Because I'm very into photography, and I actually have a big set of photographs from this time period kind of just showing what's going on. I didn't bring that many today, but I'll show you a couple. So let's first start with Japanese women. So at the start point in this time period, roughly 40% of Japanese men are literate, and about 15% of Japanese women are literate, so probably a higher number than in China, but still pretty low. So the first impact that's going to happen of Meiji reforms is that you get girls are going to be sent to school, primary school. So suddenly you're going to really change the skill levels of Japanese women to the extent that being literate is an improvement in their skill levels. So that's going to be one big change. The second big change is going to be Christian universities, especially targeting junior colleges. They're going to become big players, and Japanese women are going to be much more skilled. And then this is going to so this is a great segue into these pictures I wanted to show you. Here we go. So I have a lot of these pictures, but these are kind of two of my favorites. So these are early photographs of kind of what cotton spinning. So this is one of the industries that's going to benefit the most from British technology, and what it would have looked like. And just this is what you've got is two people making one strand of thread, okay? And this would have been roughly what it would have looked like in 1870 or 1875 in Japan. And you've got the man over here is he's kind of separating the fibers and combing the fibers, and the woman over here is actually doing the spinning. And here you have kind of two people per piece of thread, okay? So what's going to happen is the Japanese are going to read, or Japanese entrepreneurs are going to read about how to mechanize this, right? And at the end of the sample, 1910, that's what it's going to look like, okay? And these are, note all of the workers in this factory, and most of these factories, cotton spinning, about 80% of the workers were either women or girls. A lot of so Japan at this time was heavily using child labor. These would have probably been 14-year-olds or something like that in these factories. But you can kind of see a number of things in this picture. First, it's no longer one woman spinning one strand of thread. There's a vast number of these machines. You can also see, at least in terms of hairstyles and dress, they seem to be significantly better off at this time period. So there's definitely their whole world is changing. And in fact, the entire design of these factories is coming from reading designs about British and American factories as well. So it's definitely going to be transformative. I mean, the other thing that's going to go away, as I'm sure you're aware, is infanticide, which is big in Japan, more or less goes away during this time period. So those are some huge changes. I mean, the imperialism issue obviously is quite complicated. I mean, so one of the issues that happens initially in Japan with the language is they don't even know what language should be spoken in Japan, right? You have lots of different dialects at this time, lots of different ways of writing. And so one of the early policies of the Japanese is to decide, what is Japanese? What is, Hyojungo or whatever? And And they decide, it's going to be the Tokyo dialect, that's what's going to go. And they spread that out across all of Japan. And then they also spread that into, they annex Hokkaido, and that then becomes Japanese, and they do Okinawa, and that also, right? They had their own language. That gets suppressed in Japan, and then as the Japanese move into Taiwan and then Korea, they're going to institute a lot of the same policies. Now, the fact that people in Korea or Taiwan are now going to be able to read technology, and actually, let me just show you kind of just your question kind of raises in imperialism, like what some of the impacts are. Whoops. Oh yeah. So you can kind of see this in the following plots, which give you kind of what's happening to per capita incomes in China, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea during this time period. And you can see kind of this is data on per capita incomes in Japan, kind of roughly around 1873. You can see that Japan starts to break away from trend. Here you have China in red. China just shows no sense of modernization. What you have here is, you have kind of the imposition of Japanese institutions in Taiwan, which hit kind of heavily in 1898 to 1905. And you can see kind of Taiwan is sort of flatlining, and then you get the institutions coming in, and you start to see Taiwan pull away, and again, something similar happening in Korea. Now, this plot does not prove to you that it was the Japanese that did this, but it certainly is consistent with it. Nor does this prove that colonization by Japan was a good thing. I'm not saying that, but it is associated with changes in economic growth in these countries, and that's kind of consistent with the fact that they're bringing in these dictionaries in, and they're bringing in modern ideas, and this may explain kind of why you have this breakaway from China for these kinds of countries.
I'd like to say thank you for your talk. You kind of touched on my question, which was talking about like how did Japanese colonies also realize their economic growth? And I just want to ask, how is the diffusion from the ideas you talked about that occurred in Japan? How fast was it realized in other countries like Taiwan, Korea, and China?
Yeah, so to some extent, that's this plot. I mean, so one of the things that I don't talk about, though I think it's also important, is land reform. And actually, one of the big reforms that's potentially driving this is land reform. So one of the so this is actually a great segue into actually one of the big Japanese industrial policies at the time. Is one of the first books that they read is an economics textbook, and kind of this academic reads it, translates it, and in that book he realizes that land taxes are the most efficient way of taxation. So up until that point, Japan, China, most of these countries would have taxed output, and it was taxed at a very high rate. The Japanese, in fact, they fund everything off taxing land. And for economists, that's a very efficient form of taxation, because basically the farmer gets to keep, initially has to make a payment to the government for the land, but then they keep 100% of any additional output. So that gives them strong incentives to work hard. So that gets implemented in Japan in 1873. So that's kind of one of the things that's coming in. But that's also kind of a foreign idea that comes in at that time. And then you get, these are the dates of the imposition of land reform in these countries. And you can definitely see in Taiwan and Korea that essentially going in and saying, no, it's not the village that's going to get taxed. And it's each individual household owns a piece of land, and you can buy and sell that piece of land. That is like the major asset for most Japanese, is the piece of land, once they get that in 1873. Prior to that, they didn't own the land. They couldn't have easily sold the land. And you see that Japan starts to take off around that time, and certainly you see that happening in Taiwan and Korea. So I think that those are some important additional factors that are there. So I think what we need to spend a lot more time thinking about is exactly, and this goes back to Dean's question, what exactly were the policies? Because there's a lot of things that are going on. Land reform seems to be an important one, because if you're a farmer, if you're a good farmer, you want to acquire more land, and if you're a bad farmer, you'd like to sell the land and do something else. And giving farmers property rights, is an important way to empower them. China doesn't do this, and to some extent in China, you still don't own land in China. So it's these are other institutions that are going into play. Uh-oh. Now I'm scared.
But I do have a question that comes from a total outsider who understands nothing about economy, and I'm curious about how the wars, Japanese war against China and Russo-Japanese war and all that, how the wars fit into the vocabulary that economists use in terms of export expenditure, government expenditure, and so on, because that's not mentioned at all. So the entire calculation occurs without never mentioning the wars. And gunji, war expenditure is great as far as I understand.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that fit into all of this calculation? And is there a vocabulary that fits into any of these categories?
So we're not looking at military expenses. Most of these industries, virtually all of these industries, are not really military type industries. So it's just textiles and various types of other manufactured products and agricultural products. So it's hard to know exactly. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that when governments spend a lot on military, they have to build new technologies. And so, that seems to be true in the US. We get a big productivity boom as we're in the Cold War, and we're financing, DARPA is financing all sorts of new technologies. It may have been happening in Japan. So if you read the history of the Russo-Japanese War in particular, they're spending a lot of money on figuring out how to build radio sets and things like that, and high explosive bombs and shells and this kind of stuff. But I don't think that's the full story, because you certainly are seeing this happening before the military expansion. Already in the 1880s, you're kind of seeing a lot happening. It wouldn't explain kind of why some industries are growing faster than others, I don't think, or why that gave them a lot of advantage. On the other hand, I do think war matters a lot for understanding pictures like this, because one of the big drivers during this time period is the Opium War in China. So the Chinese lose that war in 1842, I think it is, or decisively lose it at that point. And the Chinese are hit with massive indemnity payments, right? And these indemnity payments require them the Qing dynasty to keep financing or keep making payments every year, because it's there are interest payments on the indemnities. And the Western powers then have an incentive to keep the Qing dynasty in power so that they can keep making the indemnity payments each year, right? So what does that mean? So that means when there are rebellions against the Qing, because they're ineffectual against the foreigners, the foreigners then suppress the rebellions and keep the Qing in power. But one of the things that I was showing you earlier is what's happening in Japan is that is super expensive, right? You're increasing expenditures by a factor of 150% during this time period. The Qing dynasty couldn't do that. And so I actually think, the Japanese certainly are looking at the Opium War and they're saying, we don't want this to be us. And so that certainly is a big motivator for them. And so there's certainly, imperialism is happening in the background. I think probably the biggest reason why China doesn't do something like this is they just simply couldn't afford it at this time period. And that's largely a story of Western imperialism. And so the Japanese sort of get lucky in the sense that they get to see the Chinese experience and then they learn from that. But the Chinese, I don't think, could have done this because they just financially lack the resources because they're paying off the Americans and the British and the French and everybody else at this time period.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting talk. I don't have a background in Japanese economy, so it was really educational for me as well. My question is about, you mentioned that the Japanese government subsidized these translations of these texts, so if you could talk a bit more about like how that happened. Like, I'm sure they had to train a lot of translators to actually translate 150 to 200 books in this sort of short span of time. And I'm sure that also created like these new industries, like that is based in sort of intellectual labor, not just like manufacturing. So if you could just expand on that a little bit. Thank you.
So starting in the Tokugawa period, the end of the Tokugawa period, they have this institute that later eventually morphs into the University of Tokyo that's designed to study foreign languages. And up until that point, they had translation capability in Dutch, but they didn't have it in English. And so they're realizing, like, to the extent they know a language, they know the wrong one, and a foreign language. And so they decide they're going to invest heavily in this. And so they essentially, so part of what they're doing is they're being forced to sign treaties with the Americans, and they don't have the words for this. And this is actually, I mentioned earlier, the Opium War, the Chinese, they didn't have words like jurisdiction and human rights and things like this. So you can imagine trying to negotiate a treaty about extraterritoriality when you don't even have those words in your language. And that was a problem in China. And so the Japanese are trying really hard to actually do this. And so initially it's kind of coming, and the translators talk about, so working for government, essentially the government is getting, samurai, most samurai are probably the most educated at this time, to try to learn English and translate stuff. And they're talking about, one of the translators talks about how when they first started trying to translate English, it would take an entire day to translate a page because it's just so hard to kind of figure this out. And they're kind of, you're going English words into Dutch and then you're trying to figure out, but the other big thing that's happening is they're sending people abroad, right? They're sending Japanese abroad. And these are very expensive missions. So there's most famously the Iwakura mission is that. And these people are learning English and coming back to Japan. And then there are some Japanese who are just on their own initiative or just, after they open up the country that decide to go abroad and spend a few years learning. That's kind of the 1860s. By the 1870s, they're institutionalizing this. So they're creating universities, and they're bringing in about 3,000 foreigners to teach in Japanese universities. There's a lovely book on this called, at least in English, called Live Machines, which is what they taught was a term they used for people with foreigners with Western skills, because you could kind of like, you know, if you spend time with them, you could kind of figure out how they think. And so they bring these people in and spend a fortune on them, but you know, they teach in the universities, and eventually the Japanese get it, or the students do, and then after the end of the 1870s, they stop doing this. But by that point, they've brought in people. So this is, I did look through Wikipedia at one point, just to kind of quickly go through the biographies of the prime ministers in the first 40 years. So this is very preliminary type stuff. And the first 40 years of Japanese prime ministers, something like 3/4 of them had spent time abroad, you know, and so people were, you know, at the top were very globalized at this point, I think, you know. When I did the same kind of search through Wikipedia for the last 40 years, it's like 30%. So, you know, these people, you know, whether it's Matsukata or it's Ito or on down the line, they've got an understanding of the West that's kind of deep. And that's all very, very expensive stuff, right? You know, and it's a problem, I think, going forward, you know, because I think, you know, the number of Japanese students abroad has fallen off, and I think that's an issue. Okay.
We need to wrap up, sadly. This was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.